The drums began to echo. It started with a sound. At first it was faint, like wood cracking under the weight of winter, but as the nights grew colder, the sound became rhythmic. No one knew where they came from, but everyone in Ashland, a small farming town in northern Wisconsin, could hear them echoing through the pine forest. Farmers would wake up before dawn and swear they'd heard something moving between the trees, shadows carrying torches, whispering in a language no one recognized. Old Samuel Carter, the oldest man in town, said the land was cursed long before the white settlers arrived. The forest had belonged to a forgotten tribe, one that vanished after a famine so severe that people began to eat the wind. But no one believed in ghost stories anymore, until the first body appeared. It was found at the edge of the woods, half buried in the snow. The skin was pale and stretched tight over the bones as if it had been sucked dry. The eyes were completely white, and the mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Next to the body, police found something else. A wooden drum, cracked in half, its surface darkened by something that looked like dried blood. The sheriff assumed it was an animal attack. But the next morning, another farmer was found dead, this time inside his barn. On the wall above him, written in blood, were the words, "He walks when the drum stops." From that day on, no one dared go near the woods after sunset. But the drumming didn't stop. At night, the wind carried it farther, a deep, slow pulse, like a heartbeat under the snow. Some said it came from the trees themselves. Others swore they saw figures dancing around fires in the distance. One night, young Eli Thompson decided to find out. He took a lantern and followed the sound. The deeper he went, the louder the drums became, until he reached a clearing surrounded by standing stones, each carved with symbols he couldn't understand. In the center of the circle there was something buried beneath the snow, something that moved. When Eli brushed away the frost, he saw a face, a human face, but the skin was gray, the eyes shut tight, and the lips were stitched together with twine. Then the drum stopped, and a voice whispered behind him, "Now you've seen the hunger." The legend of the Wendigo. Eli didn't remember how he got home that night. He only remembered the sound, a dull thumping inside his head that wouldn't go away. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, but within days strange things began happening. Cattle were found mutilated, their bones stripped clean. People began hearing chanting near the woods, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the middle of the day. The sound came and went like breathing. An old native woman named Martha Greywolf, who lived on the reservation nearby, heard about the drums and came to warn them. She told Eli's mother, "It's not the dead who walk. It's hunger itself. You have awakened it." When asked what she meant, she told them the story of the Wendigo. Long ago, before the settlers arrived, there was a tribe that lived by the lake, hunters and shamans who respected the forest spirits. But one winter food ran out. People began to die. The chief's son, desperate to save his family, made a pact with the spirit of the cold. He offered his flesh in exchange for strength and survival. The spirit accepted, but what entered his body wasn't life. It was hunger without end. He devoured his tribe, one by one, until there was nothing left but drums and wind. The survivors, horrified, trapped his spirit inside a human body and buried it beneath the standing stones. They called it the drum of hunger. Every beat was meant to keep the spirit asleep. But if the drum stopped, the Wendigo would awaken again. Eli realized then that on the night he went into the forest, the drums had stopped. And now they had started again. But something was different. There was a new rhythm. A faster, hungrier one. The following days were chaos. The snow turned darker, animals fled the woods, and people began to see pale silhouettes watching from between the trees, tall, gaunt figures with blank white eyes. And at night, when the wind blew from the north, you could hear them chanting in the old tongue. "Feed the drum. Feed the flesh." One morning, Martha Greywolf's house was found empty. The door stood open, the fire still burning. On the floor, a handprint made of ash pointed toward the forest. The sheriff organized a search, but they found nothing, except a single drumbeat that echoed through the trees, shaking the air like thunder. The snow that watches. By mid-January, Ashland was a ghost town. Most families had fled to the south, leaving their barns and animals behind. Those who stayed lived with their doors barred and windows covered in crosses and sage bundles. But none of that stopped the drums. Eli's mind began to break. He hadn't slept in days. He said he could see faces forming in the frost on the windows, eyes blinking from inside the ice. Every night, the same dream haunted him. A man made of bark and bone, walking on all fours with ribs that moved like hands. Behind him, a trail of whispering voices followed, chanting in rhythm with the drums. He eats what remembers. The town's pastor, Reverend Collins, called for a meeting at the old church, saying they'd pray until dawn. About 15 people gathered. As the prayers began, the temperature dropped drastically. The candles flickered and went out. Then came the sound, the drums just outside the church walls. Someone screamed. When they looked to the windows, they saw white eyes staring in, dozens of them, motionless. Collins ordered everyone to stay still. He began chanting the Lord's Prayer louder and louder, but his voice changed. It deepened, slowed, until it wasn't his anymore. Eli swore that the Reverend's mouth began to stretch, his jaw dislocating, while the drums matched his heartbeat. His skin turned gray, his pupils vanished. And then he stopped praying. He smiled. "He's not outside anymore," Collins said. "He's in here." The church doors blew open and a freezing wind swept in, carrying with it the smell of rot and iron. The candles lit themselves again, but the flames burned black. By dawn, the church was empty. Only Eli was found alive, wandering barefoot in the snow, his eyes wide open but seeing nothing. He kept repeating one sentence. The drums came from the ground. Voices beneath the soil. They took Eli to a hospital in Ironwood, where he remained catatonic. But the nurses began to complain. At night, they could hear a drumbeat under the floor, perfectly steady. One night, a nurse recorded it. When they played it back, the sound came with whispers in a native language, a voice saying, "You woke me." The recording was confiscated. The next morning, the hospital's basement flooded, but it wasn't water. It was melted snow, dripping through the cracks as if the ground itself was sweating. Meanwhile, back in Ashland, the few remaining farmers began seeing things in the forest again. Flickers of fire between the trees. Figures standing in silence. And always the drums. Jacob Turner, one of the last men still living there, decided to confront it. He followed the sound deep into the woods, until he reached the old circle of stones. There the snow was untouched, but the air vibrated with every drumbeat. Then he saw them, a group of pale figures dancing slowly, their movements synchronized, faces hidden behind masks made of bark. In the center, a tall figure stood completely still, its head crowned with antlers. Jacob tried to speak, but his words froze in his throat. The figure raised one hand and the drums stopped instantly. Then, in perfect silence, the figure turned its head toward him. Its face was human, but the skin was cracked, the mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and the eyes were completely white. When it opened its mouth, Jacob heard his own voice coming out. "You shouldn't have followed the sound." He fired his gun, but there was no recoil, the bullet never left the barrel. The snow beneath him opened like a mouth, and he was swallowed whole. Days later, they found his footprints leading to the clearing, but none returning. Eli, still in the hospital, woke up that same night, screaming. The nurses said he'd clawed at his chest, yelling, "He's under the roots." The next morning, the hospital room was empty. Only a trail of frost remained where he'd been lying. The call within the flesh. The forest silence was never the same after that night. Mornings were gray, and the wind carried whispers that seemed to repeat names. Cows fell ill, their bodies later found ripped apart, as if something had eaten them from the inside. Eli Thompson, sleepless for days, began to hear the drum even when it wasn't playing. It was as if the heartbeat of the earth was pulsing in sync with his own. One moonless night, Eli woke to the sound of wood breaking. It came from the barn. He grabbed his rifle and went down. Every step creaked like a warning. When he opened the door, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of metal and decay. Inside, a cow's carcass hung suspended, wrapped in roots that pulsed like veins. The drumbeat grew louder. Then came a voice, low and rasping, speaking between each beat. The hunger calls. The earth answers. Eli ran, stumbling through the snow until he collapsed in the road. When he looked back, the barn was empty, no roots, no blood, nothing. But he could still hear the drum inside his chest. Days later, the smell of raw flesh followed him everywhere, in the water, on his clothes, even on his hands. He tried to pray, but the words dissolved into murmurs. And then the dreams began. In them, Eli saw a forest full of frozen bodies, all staring upward. Around them, thin gray figures beat drums made of human skin. In the center stood a tall, skeletal man with white eyes and a long jaw, the Wendigo. Each dream he was closer. And when Eli woke, his arms bore scratch marks as if he'd tried to claw something out of his own flesh. One day, a team of reporters came to Ashland to investigate. During the interview, while filming inside Eli's house, the sound of drumming began faintly in the background. The technician boosted the audio and screamed, ripping off his headphones, blood pouring from his ears. He said he'd heard a voice saying his name. The footage from that night showed flickering lights, blurred shapes, and the trees shaking as if alive. In the final frame, before the camera fell, Eli looked directly into the lens, his eyes completely white, whispering, "He's awake." The video never aired. Fragments leaked online, but those who watched them claimed to hear drumming even with the volume off. A few days later, the technician's body was found by the roadside. His teeth were shattered. His tongue was gone. On Eli's barn wall, written in dried blood, police found a phrase: "The drum beats inside the flesh." The mirror of hunger. After the disappearances, only a few residents remained in Ashland. Among them was Lucas, the youngest son of Sam Carter, one of the missing farmers. At 23, he didn't believe in any of it, until the night he saw the footprints. They were massive, longer than any human stride, pressed deep into the snow. Lucas followed them with a lantern and his father's rifle. The trail led to the stone circle. There he found something resting between two stones, a cracked mirror, old and rusted. When he looked into it, he saw the reflection of the trees, but not his own. In the glass stood a gaunt, scarred figure with white eyes and jagged teeth, watching him. He spun around, nothing. But in the reflection, the creature was still there, closer. Then he realized the mirror didn't reflect the real forest. It showed another one, darker, full of corpses frozen in the snow. In the distance, shadows beat drums. Lucas tried to shatter the mirror, but the glass repaired itself each time he struck it. Then a skeletal arm of ice broke through the surface and grabbed his wrist. The cold burned like fire. He screamed and tore himself free, running through the woods, leaving his rifle and lantern behind. Hours later, Lucas was found wandering the highway, frostbitten and delirious. In the hospital, nurses claimed to hear rhythmic thumps from his room, like a heartbeat made of drums. By morning he was gone. The window was open. On the wall, written in blood, "The hunger crossed the mirror." The next day, witnesses reported seeing a figure walking on the frozen lake, tall, thin, arms too long for its body. The wind carried drumming again, but this time different. Not wooden. Flesh. The forgotten ritual. Winter in Ashland had grown longer than anyone could remember. Days no longer seemed to dawn completely, and the sun, when it appeared, looked pale and sickly. The trees were coated in thick ice that never melted, and the abandoned farmhouses stood like exposed bones in the frozen landscape. Those who still lived there spoke in whispers, about a sound coming from beneath the ground, as if something alive was breathing under the earth. The last active farm belonged to the Moore family, who struggled to survive with the little cattle they had left. Jonathan Moore, the patriarch, was a skeptical man who mocked the old stories. But everything changed the night his son Caleb disappeared. Caleb was 16. He had gone out to check the barn and never returned. When the family searched for him, they found only his hat caught in a tree branch and deep drag marks in the snow, leading toward the stone circle at the edge of the forest. Desperate, Jonathan grabbed a shovel and a lantern, determined to dig up whatever was buried there. And he found something. The ground was frozen, but beneath the first layers, there were human bones, dozens of them burned and fused together. Jonathan dug deeper until he uncovered a skull with teeth far too long and hollow black eyes. Before he could react, the sound began. Drums. At first faint, then louder, until the ground itself trembled beneath his feet. The lantern flame went out. The shadows between the trees began to move. They weren't people. They were spirits with broken bodies walking in circles. At the center of the clearing, a tall figure rose slowly, draped in dead skin and dry branches. Its eyes were white, pupil-less. Its face elongated, like a human skull stretched into that of a deer. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out wasn't a roar, it was the voice of hundreds, crying and begging for flesh. Jonathan tried to run, but something pulled him back. The Wendigo grabbed him by the neck and whispered in a language older than the forest itself, the tongue of the Algonquian shamans. You have broken the seal of hunger. Now it lives within your flesh. Jonathan's body was found 2 days later, tangled in frozen roots, his mouth wide open as if still screaming. What horrified investigators most was that his body was completely dry, bloodless, as though emptied from the inside. Soon after, others began to vanish. Villagers reported seeing figures moving among the trees, tribal shapes, draped in furs and ashes, beating drums beneath the snow. Sometimes one would turn and stare back, its eyes glowing white and its body covered in symbols drawn with blood. When the drumming stopped, the wind would carry one last beat, like a warning. An old native man named Benjamin Greywolf, the last descendant of the local tribe, came to town to speak to the sheriff. He said the Wendigo had been awakened because the drum of hunger had been disturbed. According to him, centuries ago, the spirit of the forest was sealed away by a sacred ritual that required the sacrifice of a living man. The drums the farmers heard were not calls of evil, they were songs of containment, keeping the beast asleep. But when the settlers unearthed the sacred bones, they broke the seal. Now the Wendigo was free. And starving. Benjamin warned that once awake, the Wendigo feeds on sound and guilt. It hunts those who hear it, consuming both flesh and spirit. The sound you hear, he said, is its heart. Each beat is the name of its next victim. That night, the old man was seen walking into the forest, carrying an ancient drum. He was never seen again. By morning, the drumming stopped. But far away, a single deep beat echoed, strong enough to crack the ice on the lake. The last beat. Without Benjamin, Ashland sank into suffocating silence. No more power. No more communication. The few families who remained tried to leave, but the roads seemed to loop back on themselves, returning them to the same cursed point. It was as if the land itself had bent, trapping them inside the Wendigo's domain. Those who stayed began to change. Some claimed to hear voices whispering in their dreams. Others felt an unbearable hunger that no food could satisfy. Meat spoiled before it cooked. Water froze even inside the house. And mirrors showed faces that didn't belong to anyone. Eli Thompson, now completely lost to madness, began writing on the barn walls with his own blood. Over and over he scrawled the same phrase. The drum must keep beating, or it wakes. The drumming returned, this time from every direction, synchronized in unnatural rhythm. It wasn't men playing anymore. The Wendigo had turned the dead into instruments, the living into voices, and fear itself into music. Hunger was the conductor. During the final week of winter, a group of armed hunters decided to enter the woods to kill the demon. They carried rifles, torches, and crucifixes. What they found defied reason. The trees were wrapped in dry human skin, as if leather had been stretched across their bark. The leaves, petrified by frost, had the shape of hands. And in the middle of the clearing where the stones once stood, there was now a massive drum made of flesh and bone, pulsing like a heart. With each beat, the snow turned red. The hunters never returned. Days later, their weapons were found abandoned in the snow, all pointing downward. A single camera lay among them, still recording. The last frame captured a tall figure, nearly 13 feet high, emerging from the flesh drum, antlers curling like thorns, white eyes burning with cold fire. The Wendigo walked toward the lens. The recording ends with a trembling male voice whispering just before the static cuts in. It doesn't want flesh, it wants memory. After that, Ashland was declared a restricted area. It no longer appears on modern maps. Those who try to reach it report strange interference, radios picking up faint drumming, disembodied voices whispering names. Some claim to see thin, pale figures walking among the trees, covered in snow, their hands striking invisible drums. The legend says the Wendigo is not a creature of flesh, but an idea that feeds on belief. Each time its name is spoken, the sound echoes somewhere in the world. Each time someone hears the drum, another heart begins to beat in rhythm. The last known audio recording, found on an old field recorder dated 1974, months after Ashland's disappearance, captures a woman sobbing softly beneath distant drums. Her voice trembles as she whispers, "They're not coming from the forest, they're coming from inside us." And then silence, a cold wind, one final deep beat shaking the recorder. The Wendigo breathes again, and with every beat, a new name is called.